"There's a trespasser in my cabin. I need an officer now," she said into the phone, loud enough for me to hear every word over the wind. And that was the exact moment I realized this wasn't going to be a normal morning, because I was standing on the front steps of a place my father built with his own hands, keys still in my grip, breath fogging in the cold mountain air, and somehow I was the one being reported. I had just driven 2 hours up a narrow gravel road, tires crunching over stone, pine trees closing in on both sides like they always did. That familiar smell of sap and damp would hitting me the second I stepped out of the truck. Everything about this place was mine. The old number plate nailed beside the door, the worn porch railing, even the dent in the step where I used to trip as a kid. And yet there she was, standing between me and the door like she owned every inch of it. Brenda Whitmore, arms crossed, chin lifted, already halfway into a story she clearly believed. More than the truth right in front of her. She didn't ask who I was, didn't hesitate, just pointed straight at me and said I didn't belong here, that this property had been under HOA control for months. Like saying it out loud enough would make it real. I remember the sound of gravel shifting under my boots as I stepped closer, slow, careful, not because I was unsure, but because I could already feel this turning into something bigger than a simple misunderstanding. She angled her phone toward me while still on the call, like she was documenting evidence, like I was some stranger wandering onto private land. "He just showed up," she said, voice sharp, confident. I've never seen him before, and I almost laughed at how easy it was for her to say that when my name had been on the deed longer than she'd lived in this county. The wind picked up again, pushing through the trees with that low hollow sound that always made this place feel isolated, cut off from everything else. And in that moment it really did feel like I was alone on that mountain with someone who had already decided how this story ended. She stepped forward and blocked the door completely. When I reached for it, like a physical line drawn in the dirt, "You're not going in there," she said, and her tone shifted just enough to make it clear she wasn't asking. I held up the keys, the same set that had opened that door for years, the metal cold against my fingers, and she barely glanced at them before knocking them out of my hand with a quick flick of her wrist. They hit the gravel with a dull clink and disappeared between the stones. And that was the first moment something didn't sit right, because when I looked back at the door, really looked, the lock wasn't the same. The old brass piece my dad installed years ago was gone, replaced with something newer, cheaper, something that didn't belong on that cabin. And that told me everything I needed to know without her saying another word. She hadn't just claimed the place, she'd been inside, changed things, made it hers in her mind, and probably in ways she thought no one would ever question. Behind her, I could see the edge of the porch camera, still angled the same way I left it. And higher up, barely visible between the branches, the trail cam mounted to the pine tree. Both of them quiet, both of them watching, and for a second I just stood there, letting the cold air fill my lungs, letting her keep talking into that phone, stacking up her version of events piece by piece. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need to interrupt, sometimes it just waits. And as the faint sound of a siren echoed somewhere down the mountain road, getting closer with every passing second, I realized she thought help was coming for her. She thought the system was about to back her up. And what she didn't know, not yet, was that she had just called it straight to me. The siren grew louder, echoing off the trees in a way that made the whole mountain feel smaller, tighter, like everything was closing in on this one moment. And Brenda straightened up the second she heard it, her voice shifting into something almost rehearsed as she spoke back into her phone, giving directions, describing me like I was a problem already solved. And I could see it in the way she stood, shoulders back, chin lifted, like she had done this before and it had always worked, like calling authority was the same thing as having it. I bent down slowly, feeling the grit of the gravel under my fingers as I picked up my keys, brushing off the dust, turning them over in my hand for a second longer than necessary. Not because I needed to, but because I was thinking, measuring, letting her keep talking. Because every word she said now mattered more than anything I could interrupt with. She paced the porch while she waited, glancing at me, like I was already on my way out, already defeated, and she started explaining out loud how this cabin had been empty for months, how the homeowners association had stepped in to maintain standards, how she personally made sure everything stayed in order. And that was when I noticed the detail that locked everything into place, the faint scratch marks around the new lock. Not clean, not professional. The kind you get when someone forces their way through something they do not have a right to. Open. And suddenly this was not just about her being wrong. It was about her believing she could rewrite ownership itself. The wind shifted again and carried the scent of fresh cut wood from somewhere deeper in the trees. And for a second it felt like the past was standing right there with me. My father teaching me how to set that original lock, how to align it so it would last through winters and storms. How he said you take care of what is yours because no one else will. And here I was, watching someone replace it like it meant nothing. Brenda stopped pacing and looked at me again, narrowing her eyes. You are not saying much, she said, almost suspicious now, like my silence did not fit the role she had assigned me. And I just nodded slightly, because there was nothing I needed to prove in that moment. Not yet. In the distance the engine cut through the quiet, tires rolling over gravel. Slower now as the vehicle approached the final bend, and Brenda stepped off the porch, moving closer to the driveway as if she wanted to be the first one to speak, the first one to control the narrative. She raised her hand and waved before the patrol car even came fully into view, already calling out, already framing the story before anyone asked a single question. And I stayed where I was, right by the door, right under the camera that had been recording this entire exchange, feeling the cold metal of the keys press into my palm. Steady, familiar, real. The patrol car pulled in and stopped at an angle, engine idling, gravel settling under the tires, and for a brief second everything went quiet except for that low hum. Like the mountain itself was holding its breath. The door opened, and the deputy stepped out, adjusting his belt, scanning the scene the way trained eyes always do, taking in both of us, the cabin, the distance between us, and Brenda immediately stepped forward, voice rising again, confident, fast, laying it all out. That is him. He just showed up. He tried to get inside. I think he might be armed. I do not know what he is capable of. And I watched the deputy listen, nod once, then shift his gaze toward me. And there was a flicker there, just a fraction of a second where recognition started to surface. But he did not say anything yet. Not immediately. Because procedure matters. Because timing matters. And I could feel the weight of everything about to turn without a single raised voice. Without a single argument. Just the truth lining up exactly where it needed to be. The deputy took 2 slow steps closer. Boots pressing into the gravel with that steady rhythm that comes from doing the job long enough to not rush anything. And Brenda immediately moved to fill the space between us again, talking faster now, layering detail over detail like she was building something solid out of thin air. I told you, he just appeared. He tried to force his way in. I have been maintaining this property for the association. We cannot have people like this wandering around. And I could hear the confidence in her voice start to tighten just a little, like she needed him to agree before she finished the story. The deputy nodded once, not committing, not confirming, just listening. And then he looked at me again, longer this time, eyes narrowing slightly as recognition finally caught up with certainty. But he still did not say anything. Not yet, because there is a moment in situations like this where everything balances, where one more word can tip it too early, and I stayed exactly where I was, one hand holding the keys, the other resting at my side, letting the silence stretch just enough to make her keep filling it. She gestured toward the door, toward the new lock, explaining how they had to secure the place after it was abandoned, how they had plans to repurpose it for community use. Every sentence drifting further away from anything that resembled the truth. And I watched the deputy's gaze follow her hand to the lock, to the frame, to the faint scrape marks that did not belong there, and then up, just slightly, to the small black lens above the porch. And that was when I saw it, that quiet shift in his posture, the kind that does not draw attention unless you know what it means. He had already started putting the pieces together. Brenda stepped closer to him now, lowering her voice like she was letting him in on something important. I have dealt with this before. People come up here thinking they can claim things, but we have rules. We enforce them. And I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was so predictable. The idea that saying we enforce somehow made it legitimate. The deputy finally spoke, calm, even, asking her how long the property had been under that control, asking who authorized the lock change, asking if there was documentation, simple questions, straightforward. And for the first time she hesitated, just a fraction, before answering, her words slowing down as she tried to keep everything aligned. and that hesitation was louder than anything she had said before. I shifted my weight slightly, the wood of the porch creaking under my boots, a sound I had heard 1,000 times growing up, and it grounded me in a way nothing else could, because this place was not just a structure, it was history, it was memory, and now it was evidence. The deputy turned to me again, finally giving me the space to speak, and I kept my voice steady, simple, giving him my name. Just my name. Nothing more, and the effect was immediate, not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet confirmation passing across his face, like a file had been opened in his mind, and everything inside it matched what he was seeing. Brenda looked between us, confusion starting to break through her certainty, like something in the room had changed, but she could not quite identify what it was. The wind moved through the trees again, carrying that same cold edge, and for a moment no one spoke, because the story she had been telling was running out of ground to stand on, and the truth, patient and unmoving, was right there waiting for its turn. The deputy took a slow breath and shifted his stance just enough to square himself between us, not blocking either side, just creating space. And when he spoke again, his tone was still calm, but carried a weight that had not been there a moment ago. Ma'am, I am going to need to see any documentation you have that authorizes you to manage or access this property. And Brenda blinked like she had not expected the question to turn in that direction, like she thought the uniform alone would carry her argument the rest of the way. She reached into her bag quickly, fingers moving with urgency now, pulling out a thin folder, papers slightly bent at the corners, and she flipped through them with a kind of forced confidence, explaining that the homeowners association had bylaws, that they had procedures for abandoned properties, that everything she had done was within her authority. But as she spoke, her voice started to lose that sharp edge it had earlier, softening just enough to reveal the strain underneath. The deputy took the papers and scanned them briefly, eyes moving line by line, not rushing, not reacting. And then he lowered them just slightly and asked another question. Is this parcel listed under your association's jurisdiction map? Simple, direct, and that was when the pause stretched longer than before, because this time she did not answer right away. She started to explain around the question instead, talking about how the boundaries were in discussion, how the community was expanding oversight, and how they had taken initiative, words that sounded official, but did not land anywhere solid. I could feel the cold air settle around us again, quieter now, like even the wind had stepped back to listen, and I watched as the deputy glanced once more toward the door, toward the lock, toward the camera above it, connecting everything without needing it spelled out. Then he handed the papers back to her, not dismissive, just final in a way that did not need emphasis, and he turned his attention fully to me. Sir, can you confirm your relationship to this property? And that was the moment everything aligned, not because I raised my voice or stepped forward, but because I did not need to. I simply met his eyes and said my full name again, clear, steady, letting it carry the weight it already held, and this time he nodded immediately, a small, respectful motion that changed the entire dynamic in a way Brenda could not ignore. She looked from him to me and back again, confusion now fully replacing the certainty she had started with. Wait, what does that mean? She asked, her voice no longer sharp, just uncertain, searching for footing that was no longer there. The deputy did not answer her right away. Instead, he reached for his radio, spoke a brief confirmation under his breath, something procedural, something that sealed what he already knew, and when he looked back up, his tone had shifted just enough to mark the line that had just been crossed. Ma'am, I am going to ask you to step back from the entrance. Not aggressive, not forceful, just firm, and for the first time since I arrived, she actually moved without arguing, just a small step at first, then another, as if the ground itself had changed under her feet. I could hear the faint creak of the porch as the space opened up between us. The door no longer blocked, the line she had drawn no longer holding, and I stayed where I was for a second longer, feeling that shift settle in, the keys still in my hand, the metal steady and real, the camera above us still recording everything, every word, every movement, and then I stepped forward, not rushing, just reclaiming the space that had always been mine. The deputy watching, Brenda silent now, and the mountain air felt different, like something had finally snapped back into place, not loud, not dramatic, just right the moment my boots crossed that invisible line. And the door was no longer blocked. Everything shifted into a different kind of quiet. Not the tense kind from before, but something steadier, like the truth had finally been given room to breathe. I stopped just short of the handle and turned slightly, not toward Brenda, but toward the deputy, because this was no longer about proving anything to her. It was about putting everything on record the right way. I held up the keys again, letting the metal catch the light, and then gestured calmly toward the lock. That is not the original hardware, I said, my voice even, controlled, the way it has to be when you're stating facts, not arguing opinions. The deputy followed the motion, stepping closer to inspect it, and up close the scratches were even clearer, rough edges around the plate, slight misalignment where it had been forced into place without care, without permission, and I could see him register it the same way I had. Piece by piece, Brenda shifted behind us, her weight moving from one foot to the other, like she was trying to find a version of this where she was still in control. We replaced it for security, she said quickly, trying to reclaim ground. But now every word sounded thinner, like it did not have anything solid underneath it. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and then I pointed just above the door. That camera has been active the entire time, I said, not raising my voice, just stating it. And that was when she looked up for the first time. Really looked, like she had forgotten it was there, like it had never mattered before this moment. The deputy glanced up as well, then back at me, and I could tell he understood exactly what that meant without needing it explained further. I reached into the back pocket of my jacket slowly, deliberately, pulling out my wallet, not rushing, not making a show of it, just part of the process, and I opened it enough for him to see what he needed to see. The badge catching the light for just a second before I closed it again. No dramatic reveal, no announcement, just confirmation. And that was the moment everything settled completely, not just for him, but for the entire scene. Because now there was no question left about who I was or why I was there. Brenda took a step back without realizing it, her shoulders dropping slightly, like something inside her had finally given way. I did not know, she said, almost to herself, and there was no anger in her voice anymore, just the sound of someone realizing they had built something on the wrong foundation. The deputy straightened, his posture shifting into something more formal, more precise, and he spoke carefully, choosing each word the way you do when it matters. Ma'am, changing the lock on a property without verified authority and restricting access to the lawful owner is a serious issue. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to, because the weight of the statement carried on its own. I stepped slightly to the side, giving him the full space to continue, because this was exactly how it needed to happen. Not loud, not chaotic, just clear, documented, and real. Brenda tried once more to speak, to explain, to reframe what she had done as something reasonable, something necessary. But now even she could hear how it sounded, how it no longer held together. The wind moved through the trees again, softer this time, and the porch creaked faintly under our shifting weight, and I looked at the door, at the place where the old brass lock used to sit, and for a brief second I could almost see it the way it had been, untouched, unchanged, and then I looked back at the present, at the new lock, at the camera, at the deputy, and I knew this was no longer just about a misunderstanding on a mountain road. This was about setting the line back where it belonged, and making sure it stayed there. The deputy took one small step back from the door and angled his body slightly toward Brenda, not confrontational, just repositioning the situation into something official, something that could not be talked around anymore. And his voice stayed level but carried that unmistakable finality. I am going to need you to explain exactly when you accessed this property and who authorized that access. And there it was, not an accusation, not a raised voice, just a line drawn in clear terms. Brenda opened her mouth quickly like she had an answer ready, but nothing came out right away. Her eyes flicked from the lock to the camera and then back to the deputy. And for the first time since this started, she looked like someone trying to remember a version of events that would actually hold up. We were maintaining it, she said finally, slower now, each word more careful than the last. It had been sitting empty, and the association cannot allow properties to fall into disrepair. And the deputy nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. Ma'am, maintenance does not include changing locks without verified ownership or legal authority, he replied, still calm, still measured, and I could hear the shift in the air again. That subtle tightening that comes when the truth is no longer something you can step around. I moved slightly toward the edge of the porch and gestured toward the tree line. There is a trail camera mounted about 15 feet up on that pine, I said, keeping my tone even. It has been recording motion for the last 3 weeks, and the deputy followed my gaze, squinting slightly until he found it. A small black square half hidden in the branches. And that was when everything fully locked into place, because now this was no longer just statements and claims. Now there was a timeline, a record, something that did not change based on who spoke first. Brenda's shoulders dropped another inch, barely noticeable unless you were watching for it. And she shifted her weight again, like the ground beneath her had become uncertain. I did not think it was a problem, she said, quieter now, almost defensive. We were trying to help the community. And the words hung there, but they did not carry the same confidence they had earlier. They sounded like something she was hoping would still matter, even though it no longer did. The deputy glanced back at me briefly, then returned his focus to her. Intent does not override property law, he said, simple, direct, and that sentence settled heavier than anything else so far. I reached into the pocket of my jacket again and pulled out a folded document. The edges worn from being carried, but the contents clear, and I handed it to him without a word. The deed copy, the trust record, everything tied back clean and official. He took it, scanned it quickly, and gave a small, confirming nod, not surprised, just completing the process, and then he spoke again. This property is privately owned and not listed under any association jurisdiction. And that was it. The final piece stated out loud, the line drawn where it had always been. Brenda let out a slow breath, like she had been holding it longer than she realized, and for a moment she did not say anything at all. The wind moved through the trees again, softer now, almost steady, and the mountain felt like it had settled back into itself. The deputy adjusted his stance once more, preparing to move forward with what came next, not rushed, not dramatic, just the next step in a process that had already decided its direction. And I stood there on the porch, keys in hand, the door finally within reach, knowing that everything she had tried to control had just slipped out of her grasp without a single raised voice, without a single argument, just facts, timing, and the truth waiting long enough to be seen. The deputy let the silence sit for a second longer, just enough for everything that had been said to settle into place. And then he shifted his attention fully back to Brenda, his tone still calm, but now carrying that unmistakable weight of procedure moving forward. Ma'am, I am going to document this as an unauthorized access and a false report until further review confirms otherwise. And the words landed clean, not loud, not aggressive, just final in a way that did not leave room for interpretation. Brenda blinked like she had misheard him, like her mind was trying to catch up to a version of events she had not prepared for. False report. She repeated, softer, like saying it out loud might change it. But it did not, because now everything was tied together. The call, the lock, the camera, the documents, all of it aligned in a way that could not be reshaped. I stepped slightly aside to give the deputy full space to continue, not because I needed to, but because this was how it should be handled, clean, orderly, recorded. He reached for his notepad, jotting down details with quick, practiced movements, asking her for her full name, her role within the association, the timeline of when she first accessed the property, and each answer she gave came slower than the last. Like every word now had to pass through the weight of what it meant. The confidence she had started with was gone, replaced by something quieter, uncertain. She tried once more to explain that she was acting in the community's best interest, that properties like this could not be left unattended. But even as she said it, she glanced toward the camera again, then toward the lock, as if she already knew those details no longer supported her version of events. The deputy listened without interrupting, writing everything down, and then he paused, looking up just long enough to make sure she understood. Intent does not change the requirement for legal authority, he said again, reinforcing the line that had already been drawn. I could hear the faint ticking of the engine from the patrol car, still idling in the driveway, the sound steady, constant, like a metronome marking the pace of everything unfolding. I walked to the edge of the porch and rested my hand lightly against the doorframe, feeling the rough wood under my palm, grounding, familiar, a quiet reminder of what this place actually was beyond all the noise. Behind me, Brenda shifted again, her voice lower now, almost careful. "What happens next?" she asked, not challenging, just asking. And that question changed the air more than anything else she had said, because it meant she understood the direction this had gone. The deputy closed his notepad with a soft snap and answered plainly, outlining that the incident would be reviewed, that the recorded evidence would be requested, that any unauthorized changes to the property would need to be addressed. No threats, no raised voice, just a process that had already begun. I turned slightly, looking out past the driveway toward the tree line where the trail camera sat, silent and steady, holding the timeline she could not rewrite, and then back to the door, to the lock that did not belong, to the keys still in my hand, and I knew that whatever came next was already anchored in something she could not undo, not with words, not with confidence, not with calls, because the truth had already been recorded, already been seen, and now it was simply moving forward, one step at a time, exactly the way it was supposed to. The deputy's words settled into the cold air like something permanent, and for a moment no one moved, not because they could not, but because everything that needed to be said had already been said, and now it was just unfolding. I turned fully back toward the door, lifting the keys again, feeling the familiar weight of them in my hand, and this time there was no one stepping in front of me, no voice cutting across the moment, just the quiet creak of the porch beneath my boots as I reached for the handle. The new lock still sitting there, wrong, out of place, but no longer an obstacle, just evidence of what had been done. Behind me, I could hear the deputy continuing, his voice steady as he explained next steps, outlining how a report would be filed, how the association's authority would be reviewed, how access to this property would be restored fully and immediately, and Brenda did not interrupt him this time. She just listened, her posture smaller now, not physically shrinking, but losing that rigid certainty she had carried when I first arrived. The wind moved through the trees again, softer now, like the mountain had settled back into its rhythm, and somewhere down the road another vehicle passed faintly, distant, normal life continuing beyond this moment. I paused with my hand on the door and glanced up once more at the camera above it, a small black lens that had watched everything without bias, without interruption, capturing each second exactly as it happened. And then I looked toward the tree line where the trail camera sat hidden among the branches, holding the rest of the story she had not realized was being written, and I knew those details would carry forward long after this moment ended. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear, consistent, undeniable. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges giving that same low, familiar sound I remembered, and the air inside the cabin met me with that mix of old wood and cold stillness, untouched in some ways, changed in others, but still mine, completely, and without question. I stepped inside just enough to cross the threshold, then turned back, not to confront, not to argue, just to look at the space as it was now, the deputy standing in the driveway, notepad in hand, Brenda a few steps behind him, no longer directing anything, no longer shaping the scene, just present in it. And for the first time since this started, there was no tension left to push against, no resistance to hold, just the outcome settling into place exactly where it should have been from the beginning. I stepped back onto the porch, pulling the door closed gently behind me, the sound soft but final, and I held up the keys once more, not as proof, not as a statement, just as something that had always belonged. The deputy gave a small nod, respectful, acknowledging the situation for what it was now, resolved in the only way it ever could be, through facts, through process, through patience. Brenda looked at the ground for a second, then back up, like she wanted to say something else, something that might shift things back, but there was nothing left to shift, because the story had already settled, not in her words, not in mine, but in everything that had been seen, recorded, and confirmed. And as the wind moved once more through the trees, steady and quiet, the mountain felt exactly the way it had when I first arrived, unchanged, grounded, real, like it had been waiting for this moment to pass so it could return to what it had always been. And I stood there on that porch, keys in hand, knowing that nothing about this needed to be forced. Because the truth had already done all the work for me, I stayed on the porch a moment longer after everything had settled, listening to the quiet return, the kind that only comes after something has been resolved the right way. Not forced, not rushed, just finished, The deputy's car engine idled a few more seconds before he stepped away to make a brief call, his voice low and procedural, already moving the situation into its next phase beyond what was visible here. And Brenda stood near the edge of the driveway, no longer trying to control anything, no longer directing. The moment, just standing there with the weight of what had actually happened settling in. I turned the key in my hand slowly, feeling the worn edges press into my fingers, and then I crouched down by the door, reaching into my truck bed for the small toolkit I always kept there, the metal clasps clicking open in the quiet air, and without a word I began removing the replacement lock, each turn of the screwdriver steady, deliberate, not out of frustration, not out of anger, just restoring something that had been altered without right. The screws came loose easier than they should have, the plate shifting slightly as I pulled it free, and for a second I held it in my hand, this cheap piece of hardware that had tried to replace something, built to last. And then I set it aside on the porch, not thrown, not discarded with force, just placed where it no longer mattered. From the toolkit, I pulled out the original brass lock I had kept stored away, the one my father installed years ago, its surface worn but solid, familiar in a way that did not need explanation, and I lined it up with the door, fitting it back into place where it belonged, tightening each screw until it sat flush, secure, exactly the way it was meant to be. Behind me I could hear the deputy finishing his call, his footsteps returning across the gravel, and when I stood back up, the door looked right again. Not new, not polished, just correct. I tested the key once, turning it slowly, feeling the mechanism catch and settle the way it always had, and the soft click echoed lightly against the wood, a small sound, but one that carried more weight than anything that had been said earlier. I stepped back and looked at the cabin for a moment, the number plate beside the door still slightly tilted the way it always had been, the porch railing worn smooth in places from years of use. And for the first time since I arrived, everything felt aligned again, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because nothing false was left standing. The deputy approached, giving a brief nod, his report already in motion, the situation documented, the process continuing beyond this point. And Brenda finally turned toward her vehicle, moving slower than before, not defeated in some loud way, just quiet, like someone who had run out of ground to stand on. She paused for a second before opening the door, glancing back once, not at me directly, but at the cabin itself, like she was seeing it clearly for the first time, and then she got in and drove away, the sound of her tires fading down the same gravel road I had come up earlier, until it was gone completely. I picked up the old replacement lock from the porch and set it in the back of my truck, not as a reminder, just as something that had no place here anymore. And then I walked back to the door, placed my hand against the wood for a second, feeling the solid weight of it, and opened it again, stepping inside fully this time. The air still cool, still carrying that quiet stillness of a place that had been waiting. And as the door closed behind me with that same familiar sound, I knew one thing for certain. She thought authority was something you could call in and use like a tool, something that showed up when you needed it. But what she learned that morning was different, because real authority does not arrive to take your side. It stands exactly where it has always belonged, and it does not need to speak loudly to be understood.